There are two kinds of smells that stay with a person long after they leave a room: the warm, dusty sweetness of old books and the sharp chemical bite of industrial cleaner. At Biogen, a glass and steel biotech giant rising over Seattle like a promise made of money and light, the second smell always wins. It lives in the mop water, in the blue liquid that stings the nose and clings to skin long after the gloves come off. It's the smell of efficiency, of things erased quickly and completely. It's the smell of a place where life-saving ideas are born during the day and all evidence of human presence is wiped away at night. That night belongs to David. He wears a dark green janitor's uniform, the fabric already softened by years of washing. On his chest, a stitched name patch reads David, though almost no one ever says it out loud. At best, he's hey. More often, he's nothing at all. At 3 in the morning, Biogen is no longer a company. It's a maze of sleeping hallways and glowing screens left on standby. Footsteps echo longer than they should. Every sound feels amplified, as if the building itself is listening. David pushes his cleaning cart slowly, carefully, as if speed might disturb something sacred. The wheels rattle no matter how often he tightens them. He knows every turn, every corner, every place where the floor dips just enough to catch a careless step. He knows where the cameras linger, where the lights flicker, where ambition sleeps behind locked doors. Most people don't see him. A few early risers arrive before dawn, their minds already elsewhere. They move fast, badges swinging, coffee steaming, eyes locked on invisible meetings ahead of them. David becomes something they walk around without noticing, like a pillar or a trash can. One morning, a voice cuts through the quiet. "So what is it today, David?" Kyle from Facilities Coordination, loud, cheerful in a way that asks for an audience. "Music for mopping?" Kyle laughs. "Rain sounds? Whale calls?" The people with him smile automatically, not cruel smiles, casual ones, the kind that don't think they're doing harm. David pauses. His hand rests on the mop handle. He's wearing earbuds, but not for music. Inside his ears, a professor is calmly explaining why people don't behave the way economic models expect them to, why humans choose stories over numbers, why incentives fail when dignity is ignored. Behavioral Economics, MIT, free lectures downloaded late at night. "I'm listening to a class," David says quietly. "A class?" David nods. "Yeah." There's an awkward second where no one knows what to do with that information. Then Kyle laughs again, softer this time. "Man, you're something else," he says, already walking away. David doesn't respond. He doesn't need to. He goes back to cleaning. Spray, wipe, step, repeat. He cleans conference rooms where people argue about ethics without ever touching the word ethics. He wipes fingerprints from glass walls that display words like innovation and humanity in brushed steel letters. He empties trash cans filled with half-written ideas and untouched pastries. No one asks him what he thinks. And that's fine. David has learned that invisibility is a strange kind of freedom. When no one is watching you, you're allowed to see. He passes an executive suite and slows for just a moment. The door is closed, but voices hum behind it. Controlled, confident, expensive. He catches his reflection in the polished nameplate. A man in gloves holding a mop. Eyes alert, mind somewhere else entirely. Then he moves on. Because corridors don't reward insight. They only punish mistakes. David understands this better than anyone. He follows the rules, he doesn't linger, he doesn't touch what he shouldn't, he leaves no trace behind. Almost none. As the night stretches on, the smell of cleaner fades slightly, replaced by something softer drifting from his earbuds. The faint rustle of turning pages, the sound of thought in motion. Somewhere beyond these hallways, there are books. Real ones. Paper. Margins. Ideas that don't disappear when wiped away. David listens as he works, unseen, unacknowledged, steady. At Biogen, brilliance has offices and titles. But wisdom is quietly pushing a cart through the dark, waiting for the right moment to be noticed. David's break wasn't marked by a bell or a supervisor's nod. It arrived the way it always did, and a small gap between tasks, when the building finally stopped demanding his hands for a moment and allowed his mind to belong to him again. He slipped into a storage room tucked behind a service hallway that most employees never realized existed. The door was unremarkable, no glossy signage, no keypad with blinking lights, just a scuffed handle and a faded label that read, "Supplies," in peeling black letters. Inside, the air was warmer. Not comfortable, just less sterile. Cardboard, paper, detergent, and something faintly metallic from the mop heads drying on hooks. The ceiling light flickered with the tired rhythm of a place that didn't get renovated because no one important ever sat here. This was David's sanctuary. He leaned his cart into its corner like a parked horse and sat on an overturned bucket. The bucket creaked, then settled. His knees protested quietly. He'd been on his feet since midnight. His hands smelled of bleach, even through the gloves. His back held the ache of a life spent lifting other people's messes and lowering his own expectations. But then he opened his lunch. A simple sandwich wrapped in wax paper, the bread slightly crushed. No artisan label, no fancy deli order, just something that kept him going. He took one bite, chewed slowly, and reached into his bag for something far more precious than food. A hardcover book, worn at the edges, the jacket folded and taped where it had torn. The title was printed in plain serif letters, as if it didn't need to shout. The Ethics of Innovation. The cover smelled faintly of old paper, dry and comforting, like the quiet corner of a library where the world can't find you. It was the opposite of Biogen's cleaner smell. This scent didn't erase, it preserved. David ran his thumb along the margin of the first page he'd bookmarked, like greeting someone he trusted. He didn't read to get rich. He didn't read because he thought a CEO would someday pat his shoulder and call him inspiring. He read because learning was the only place his life felt expandable, like it could grow beyond what it had been assigned. Out in the main building, people had titles with glass doors and ergonomic chairs. In here, David had a bucket, a flickering bulb, and ideas that made his heart beat differently. He turned a page, and the words met him the way they always did. Not like instructions, but like questions. What does it mean to change the world if the world becomes less fair in the process? What does it mean to save lives if access becomes a luxury? David chewed another bite of sandwich, eyes moving steadily across the lines. He had the kind of focus that comes from longing sharpened into discipline. And still, the building found a way to remind him who he was supposed to be. The door cracked open without a knock. "Of course," a voice said, dripping with lazy amusement. "Where else would the janitor be?" It was Kyle again, and one of the younger lab techs behind him, faces half lit by the hallway. They weren't here for supplies, they were here for entertainment. Kyle leaned against the doorframe, squinting at the book as if it were written in another language. "What is that, a manual on mopping with meaning?" The lab tech laughed under his breath. David didn't slam the book shut, he didn't hide it, he didn't apologize for it. He just held his place with a finger and looked up calmly. "It's about ethics," he said. Kyle barked a short laugh. "Ethics? Wow." He nodded as if he'd discovered something hilarious. "You planning to give a TED talk to the trash cans?" David's eyes stayed steady. "No," he said. "I'm planning to understand the world I work in." That answer landed differently. Not enough to stop the mockery, but enough to change the air. Kyle's smile thinned. He recovered quickly because people like Kyle were trained to recover. "Well," he said, clapping his hands once, "don't let us interrupt your genius time." He glanced at the lab tech. "Come on, let the man read his bedtime story." They disappeared, the door swinging shut behind them. For a second, David sat very still. Not wounded the way they would assume, but tired. Tired of being a punchline. Tired of the way people used laughter as a permission slip to be careless. He looked down at the page again, but the words blurred for a moment, not from tears, but from memory. He thought of his mother, years ago, telling him that work was work and dreams were expensive. He thought of the night shifts he'd taken so he could avoid childcare costs. He thought of the bills that arrived like clockwork, the way poverty never slept. And yet, here he was, reading ethics inside a company that built medicines. David exhaled slowly, as if releasing something he couldn't afford to carry. He turned the page again, because this room, this cramped, ignored room, was the one place in Biogen where he didn't feel invisible. Here, his thoughts mattered. Here, his questions had weight. Out there, he was the man who erased traces. In here, he was the man who left them, quietly, line by line, in the margins of his own mind. The storm didn't arrive politely. It came like Seattle had been holding its breath all day and finally let go. By late afternoon, the sky over downtown turned the color of bruised steel. Wind shoved rain sideways between buildings. Streetlights blinked on early, ashamed of how little they could do against that kind of weather. David clocked out with the same quiet efficiency he brought to everything else. No lingering, no small talk, just a nod to the security guard and a steady walk toward the transit stop 2 blocks away, shoulders already bracing for the cold. At the bus shelter, a handful of commuters stood with hunched backs and phone glow faces. Everyone looked like they were trying to shrink inside themselves, as if being smaller might keep the rain from finding them. David stood slightly apart, holding a black umbrella with a bent rib, old but functional. His work bag hung from one shoulder. His earbuds were out now. He didn't need a lecture to tell him what scarcity felt like. He could feel it in the dampness creeping up his pants, in the sting in his fingers, in the way his paycheck always seemed to disappear before he even saw it. Then he noticed her, an older woman, maybe late 60s, standing at the edge of the shelter like she'd misjudged the distance between herself and safety. Her coat was plain, her shoes sensible, no jewelry that screamed money, no entourage. Just a woman with silver hair pulled back neatly, rain dotting her shoulders like punctuation. She was looking around, not panicked, but unsettled. Her hands searched her pockets once, then again, more urgently. She checked a tote bag, then froze, as if realizing something she didn't want to admit out loud. She took a step forward, then back. Her lips moved slightly, like she was counting what she didn't have. No phone, no wallet, no cash. A man near her glanced over, registered the inconvenience, then looked away. Another commuter shifted, pretending to be absorbed in his screen. In a city that prided itself on kindness, the storm made everyone selfish by default. David watched her for a long moment. He didn't rush in, he didn't perform concern. He simply observed the way she kept looking down the street, as if waiting for a solution to appear with headlights. Finally, he walked closer, slowly enough not to startle her. "Are you okay?" he asked. She turned, eyes sharp with the kind of pride that doesn't like needing help. She hesitated. "I left my bag on the streetcar. I realized it 2 stops ago." Her voice tightened. Everything was in it. David nodded once, as if she'd told him the weather report. "Do you need to call someone?" A small, humorless laugh escaped her. That would require a phone. He glanced down the street. The rain was relentless. Cars moved like ghosts through sheets of water. He could have said sorry. He could have offered sympathy. Words were cheap. Instead, David reached up and held out his umbrella. The woman stared at it, confused. "No," she began, reflexively refusing what looked like charity. David didn't push it into her hands. He just offered it, steady, as if it was the most normal thing in the world. "You need it more than I do," he said. Her brows knit together. "You'll get soaked." He shrugged, small and calm. I'm already wet." She looked at him, really looked, like she was noticing for the first time that he wasn't dressed for comfort, that his shoes were worn, that his hands carried the faint smell of work. Then he added, quietly, with a sincerity that didn't try to impress, "Wisdom and kindness shouldn't get drenched." The woman's expression shifted. Something softened, something complicated. She took the umbrella like she was accepting a debt she didn't want to, but knew she couldn't refuse. Before she could say thank you, David stepped out into the open rain. He walked fast at first, then broke into a jog, head down, coat darkening, water running off his sleeves. The storm wrapped around him without mercy. And behind him, under the shelter, the older woman stood holding his umbrella, staring after the disappearing shape of a man the world had trained itself not to see. She held the umbrella the way you hold something borrowed from a stranger, carefully, as if the wrong grip might break whatever quiet agreement had just been made. Around her, the bus shelter felt smaller. The commuters were still there, still pretending not to notice what had happened, but the air had changed. A few faces glanced toward the rain-washed sidewalk where David had vanished. Not admiration exactly, more like discomfort, the kind that appears when someone else behaves better than you expected. The older woman stepped out from under the shelter and angled the umbrella into the wind. The rain kept trying to steal it from her hands, tugging at the canopy like an argument. She looked down at the handle as if it might explain him. That's when she saw it. A strip of clear tape wrapped around the grip. Old tape, yellowed slightly at the edges. Under it, neat handwriting in black marker. Property of David, Biogen cleaning debt. The words were plain. Practical. Not a brand, not a joke, just a simple declaration of existence. David had labeled his umbrella the way someone labels a lunch in a shared fridge, because he understood how easily the world takes what isn't marked, how quickly the unimportant gets misplaced. She read it again, slower. Biogen, cleaning debt. Biogen, her company. The company whose name sat on buildings and news articles and investor decks. The company she had built, defended, negotiated for, sometimes at the cost of sleep, sometimes at the cost of herself. And yet, in this storm, she had been reduced to something she rarely allowed herself to be, a person without resources. No assistant, no driver, no credit card, no authority. Just a woman standing in the rain with a borrowed umbrella, realizing that the only person who had stepped toward her wasn't in a suit. A bus pulled in with a hiss, doors folding open like a sigh. Voices moved, shuffled, boarded. The commuters filed in with their shoulders tight, their eyes forward. The older woman stayed where she was, still staring at the tape. She didn't know his last name. She didn't know his story. She didn't know anything that would help her place him neatly into a category. But she had his name in her hand, David. And she had the evidence of something more unsettling than kindness, intention. This wasn't a grand gesture from someone with plenty to spare. This wasn't a rich man donating money that wouldn't change his life. This was a working man giving away the one thing between himself and pneumonia because it was the right thing to do. She tightened her grip and looked down the street again. Rain blurred the sidewalk into watercolor. David was gone. Of course he was gone. People like him moved through the world like shadows, appearing only long enough to solve a problem, then vanishing before anyone could say thank you properly. She stepped onto the bus, paid with the last emergency bill she'd forgotten in her coat pocket, an old habit from a childhood that never trusted comfort. She sat near the window, umbrella across her lap, and watched Seattle streak by in gray lines. Her mind, usually filled with board votes and compliance updates and timelines, kept returning to that strip of tape. Property of David. The phrase bothered her in a way she couldn't name at first, not because it was wrong, but because it was true in too many ways. The world had made David property of a department, assigned, categorized, overlooked. And yet, he'd just done something no job description required. She reached into her coat pocket instinctively, searching for her phone again, forgetting, then remembering. A quiet frustration rose in her chest, not at losing her bag, at losing control, because control was what she sold to herself as safety. But in that bus seat, damp and ordinary, holding an umbrella labeled by a man she'd never met, she felt something else. A trace. A small, stubborn line connecting her to a part of her company she never had to see if she didn't want to. And she realized, with an unfamiliar tightness behind her eyes, she did want to see it. Morning at Biogen didn't feel like the night at all. Daylight turned the glass walls into mirrors and made everything look clean even before anyone cleaned it. The lobby filled with the smell of espresso and expensive perfume. People moved with purpose, shoes clicking sharply against polished floors, badges swinging like proof of belonging. David arrived before most of them, as always. He slipped into the service elevator, rode up with a quiet hum, and stepped into a hallway that would soon be crowded with ambition. He worked while the building woke, and somewhere above him, behind doors that only opened for certain keycards, Biogen's real storm was forming. In the VIP conference room, the air was too cold on purpose. The table was long enough to feel like a border. At the far end sat Carol, no longer the older woman at a bus stop, but the CEO of a biotech empire. Today, her suit was charcoal gray. Her hair was perfectly arranged. Her expression, composed, almost serene, had been built over decades of learning when to reveal nothing. But the umbrella was in her office, leaned carefully in a corner like a secret she hadn't decided how to explain yet. Around her sat board members and senior executives, each with a tablet open, each with a practiced face that said they were here to protect the company, even if the company's purpose got bruised in the process. A large whiteboard filled one wall, crowded with numbers, cost projections, manufacturing timelines, pricing tiers, the kind of math that could feel objective until you remembered math was always used by people. A projector glowed softly, displaying the name of the project in bold letters, Project Lifeline, a drug with the potential to treat a rare fatal condition, the kind of drug that got featured in glossy press releases, the kind of drug that could change families' futures, but also the kind of drug that could be priced so high it only changed the futures of people who could afford it. A junior analyst spoke first, voice crisp, eyes eager. Manufacturing costs have risen 15%. The supplier contracts are locked. To maintain margins, we'll need to increase price per dose by... He tapped, numbers updated. A few heads nodded, as if the equation had solved itself. Then a young intern, sharp suit, sharper confidence, leaned forward like he'd been waiting for his moment. "Let's be honest," he said, smiling slightly. "Profit is the only real measure of success. If we can't monetize it properly, we should kill the project before it kills our quarterly." The word kill hung in the air too long. Carol's gaze didn't flicker. She said, "That's one opinion," she said evenly. A board member, older, expensive watch, spoke as if delivering common sense. "We have obligations, shareholders. If this becomes a charity project, we jeopardize everything." Carol listened, but inside her mind, something kept shifting like a pebble in a shoe. Because she'd stood in the rain yesterday with no wallet, no phone, no power. She'd felt what it meant to need help and not have it. And now she was watching people discuss whether help was worth it. On the board, the numbers were clean, too clean. They described production costs and market size, but not the human cost of deciding the drug was unviable. Not the cost of families watching a loved one decline while a solution sat behind a paywall. Carol tapped her pen once against the table, a small sound, but enough to recenter the room. She said, "Walk me through the assumptions." The analyst hesitated, then began again. "We're using standard value-based pricing models, benchmarking against comparable therapies. Market tolerance suggests—" He gestured to the whiteboard as if it were a courtroom exhibit. Carol stood slowly, moving to the board. She studied the figures, not with confusion, but with the focus of someone hunting for what had been omitted. There it was, a missing column, a missing dimension. Everything was calculated in dollars, but nothing was calculated in trust, in reputation, in long-term public benefit, in what the community would give back to Biogen if Biogen didn't treat them like a revenue stream. She didn't say it yet, not in this room, not with these people watching. Instead, she turned back, calm as a judge. She said, "Pause. No decisions today. I want alternative pathways by tomorrow morning, options that account for broader value." The intern's smile tightened. "With respect, Carol, the board—" Carol held his gaze. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "With respect," she echoed, "the board works for the mission, not the other way around." Silence spread like ink. Somewhere far below, in the corridors that didn't matter to people like the intern, David continued pushing his cart through the building, unseen, while the future of a life-saving drug balanced on the edge of a whiteboard. The conference room emptied, the way power always does, quickly and without apology. Chairs slid back, tablets snapped shut, voices lowered into private calculations as executives filed out, already reframing the meeting in their heads. By the time the door closed, the room felt abandoned, like a stage after the actors had left, but the story was still hanging in the air. The whiteboard remained. Numbers, arrows, boxes drawn and redrawn until certainty looked like chaos, pretending to be logic. The phrase Project Lifeline still hovered at the top, bold and hopeful, now weighed down by columns of cost. Minutes later, the service door opened quietly. David entered with his cart, the smell of cleaner preceding him like a warning no one was there to hear. He paused just inside the doorway, not from fear, but habit. Conference rooms like this were fragile spaces. People protected them with rules, with cameras, with contracts that made curiosity a liability. He scanned the room automatically. No phones, no laptops left behind, no coffee rings on the table yet. It was his job to make the room forget what had happened inside it. As he worked, his eyes kept returning to the board, not because he was nosy, but because he couldn't not see it. The numbers were wrong. Not mathematically. They added up just fine. But something essential was missing. Something David had been listening to just the night before, through his earbuds while wiping glass at 3 a.m. Externalities. Community value. Long-term trust. The invisible returns that never fit neatly into quarterly models, but decided whether companies survived scandals or became them. He stepped closer, careful not to touch anything. He read the assumptions quietly, like a prayer said under his breath. market tolerance, price elasticity, competitive benchmarks, all framed as if people were variables instead of lives. David swallowed. He knew the rule. He was not allowed to erase the board, not allowed to add to it, not allowed to interact with anything that could be considered proprietary information. Violations meant termination, immediate, no appeal. The thought passed through him cleanly. Walk away. He could clean the table, empty the trash, pretend he hadn't noticed. No one expected him to contribute anything but silence. But then another thought followed, quieter, heavier. If everyone who sees the problem stays quiet, the problem wins. David didn't pick up a marker. He reached instead into the pocket of his uniform and pulled out a small square of yellow paper, a post-it, the kind people used for reminders, not revolutions. He held it for a moment, feeling the absurd weight of it, a piece of paper small enough to be ignored, harmless enough to be overlooked. He wrote carefully, using his own pen, not opinions, not criticism, just a formula, a simple adjustment that accounted for community adoption, long-term public trust, reduced regulatory friction, factors that could offset immediate margin loss over time, a way forward without touching what wasn't his. He didn't sign it. He didn't explain it. He stepped forward and placed the post-it gently on the corner of the whiteboard, barely overlapping the existing calculations, like a whisper that didn't interrupt. For one terrifying second, he stood there, exposed, as if the room itself might accuse him. Nothing happened. David exhaled slowly. He finished cleaning. He wiped the table until it shone. He straightened the chairs. He took the trash bag and tied it carefully, like sealing away evidence of a life-changing decision no one had made yet. At the door, he stopped once more and looked back at the board. The post-it was still there. Small, yellow, easy to miss, but present. David turned off the lights and left the room exactly as he'd found it, except for that one quiet suggestion, waiting for someone important enough to read it. Carol returned to the VIP conference room for the thing no one admitted out loud, to be alone with the problem. She told her assistant she needed 5 minutes. It sounded ordinary, but 5 minutes of solitude was rarer than a breakthrough. The hallway outside was bright, busy, clean. Inside, the conference room was dim and still, the air conditioning whispering like it had secrets. Carol's eyes went straight to the whiteboard. The numbers were still there, aggressive in their neatness, Project Lifeline boxed in by projections and assumptions. She stepped closer, scanning, hunting for a pathway that didn't betray the mission. Then she saw it. A small yellow square in the corner of the board, like a firefly trapped against glass. A post-it. She stared for a beat, confused, not by the content, but by the audacity. The board was treated like scripture. People with titles wrote on it. People without titles didn't even stand too close to it. Carol reached up and read. Her gaze sharpened, moving line by line. Not sentiment, not a plea. A calculation, elegant, restrained, and strangely humane. It wasn't lower the price because it's nice. It was here's what you're missing and here's how it changes the future. She felt something in her chest shift, the way it shifts when you realize the smartest voice in the room wasn't invited. And then, through the glass wall by the corridor, she saw him. A man in a dark green uniform, cloth in hand, moving steadily along the windows like part of the architecture, head slightly bowed, calm, precise. David. The umbrella flashed in her mind so clearly it almost made her look around for it. The tape, the handwriting, property of David, Biogen, cleaning department.
Her hand hovered near the post-it. She didn't remove it. She didn't smile. She simply watched David through the glass. And before she could decide what to do with that moment, the door behind her swung open. A mid-level manager stormed in, Tom Haskins, security compliance, a man who wore policies like armor. His eyes landed on the post-it and widened as if he'd found contraband. "What the hell is that?" he snapped. Carol didn't answer yet. She kept looking at the paper, then at David beyond the glass. Tom marched to the board. "This room is restricted. The whiteboard contains proprietary project data. Any interaction, any alteration is a breach." He turned sharply, spotting David outside. His voice rose, sharpened by the thrill of authority. "You," he barked, slamming his palm against the glass, as if the sound alone could summon obedience. David paused mid-wipe. He didn't flinch. He set the cloth down calmly and walked to the door. Tom opened it hard. "Did you put this on the board?" he demanded, jabbing a finger toward the post-it. "Do you understand what you've done? This is a violation. We have NDAs. We have security protocols. You don't touch anything in here." David's face remained composed. His voice, when it came, was quiet, almost gentle. "I didn't erase anything. I didn't copy anything. I didn't take a photo." Tom scoffed. "You don't get to decide what counts as a breach. You're not authorized to write in this room, period. I can have you terminated today." The threat hung there like the storm cloud from yesterday, only this time the rain was fluorescent and cold. David glanced once at the board, then back at Tom. Not pleading, not defensive, just steady. "I understand the policy," he said. "I wasn't trying to break it." Tom leaned in, hungry for submission. "Then why did you do it?" David's eyes flicked, almost imperceptibly, toward Carol, like he'd only just realized she was there, weighing him. He didn't answer Tom, not yet, because the room had changed. Power had entered, and Carol, not bus stop Carol, stood between the post-it and the threat, silent, considering whether rules were about protection or control.
Carol didn't move right away. She let the silence stretch until it became its own kind of authority, the kind that made people hear their own breathing and realize they were not the loudest thing in the room. Tom was still standing too close to David, performing his outrage like it was a job requirement. David stood with his hands relaxed at his sides, damp cloth forgotten on the floor, eyes calm in a way that looked almost dangerous to men who relied on panic to prove dominance. Carol finally spoke. "Stop." The word wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. It landed cleanly, like a gavel. Tom turned toward her, already rehearsing a justification. "Carol, this is a clear violation of—" "Stop," she repeated, softer this time, and somehow that made it sharper. Not another sentence. Tom's mouth stayed open for a beat, then closed. He straightened, trying to reclaim the posture of someone who belonged here more than the janitor did. Carol walked past him without looking at him. That was the part Tom would remember later, the way she dismissed him like a minor inconvenience. She went to the conference table and placed something down with deliberate care. An old black umbrella. The rib still bent, the handle still wrapped in tape. It looked almost absurd against the million-dollar room, like a piece of the outside world had snuck in and refused to be polished. Carol's fingers rested on it a moment, as if anchoring herself to the truth it represented. Then she looked at David. He met her gaze steady, not arrogant, a man who had already accepted the worst could happen and was still choosing to stand like a person. "This umbrella," Carol said, "kept me from getting soaked yesterday." Tom blinked, confused, thrown off script. Carol continued, her voice calm but warm in a way that made the room feel less sterile. "I was at a bus stop, in the rain, no phone, no wallet, no way to prove who I was." Tom's face tightened. He glanced at David like he was trying to solve a puzzle he didn't like. Carol lifted her eyes to the whiteboard. And this, she said, nodding toward the post-it, kept us from making a decision that would have drowned a project meant to save lives. Tom cleared his throat, trying to wedge policy back into the air. Carol, with respect, we can't allow unauthorized staff to... Carol turned her head slowly and looked at him for the first time since he'd entered. Her expression wasn't angry, it was worse than anger. It was disappointed. With respect, she said, you are confusing security with ego. Tom stiffened. This is not about ego, it's about compliance. It's about outcomes, she replied. It's about whether our rules protect the mission or just protect the comfort of people who already have power. She reached up and peeled the post-it from the board, not as evidence, but as something fragile that deserved to be handled carefully. She read it again, then looked at David. Did you write this? David didn't try to dodge it. Yes. Tom exhaled like he'd been waiting for a confession. Then I'll initiate. Carol lifted a hand, and Tom stopped again, mid-sentence, like a dog yanked by an invisible leash. David spoke before she could, his voice measured. I didn't erase anything. I didn't copy anything. I didn't share anything. I used what I know to point at what was missing. Carol's eyes softened just slightly. And what you know, she said, comes from where? David hesitated for the first time, not from fear, but from the vulnerability of saying something true in a room designed for performance. I listen, I read, I try to understand the work that happens here because it matters. Carol nodded slowly, as if that sentence connected two worlds that had been kept apart on purpose. Then she turned back to Tom. No one is firing him. Tom's jaw tightened. He breached protocol. He offered insight, Carol said, and he did it without touching what he wasn't allowed to touch. If you want to talk about protocol, then talk about the protocol that lets brilliant people be ignored because they wear the wrong uniform. Tom looked like he wanted to argue, but arguing with a CEO in her own conference room was a kind of career suicide, even for a man who loved rules. Carol placed the post-it on the table next to the umbrella, a pairing that felt symbolic in the way the room couldn't sanitize. Carol looked at David again, voice low, almost private. You don't just clean this building, she said. You see what we've been blind to. And for the first time in a long time, David's invisibility cracked, not into fame, not into fantasy, but into recognition, real and heavy and frightening, like sunlight after years underground. The next morning, Carol didn't summon David to her office the way movies did. No dramatic elevator ride, no private handshake that magically turned a janitor into a millionaire by lunchtime. She understood something most people in power forgot. If you truly respect someone, you don't make their life a spectacle. You change the system around them so it can no longer pretend they don't exist. So she chose the only stage that mattered at Biogen, the all-hands meeting. The auditorium filled fast, rows of employees, researchers, analysts, managers, interns. The air buzzed with caffeine and curiosity. People whispered about Project Lifeline, about board tension, about the rumor that the CEO had gone soft. A few even whispered about the janitor who touched the VIP board, like David was a cautionary tale. David stood in the back, near the exit, because that's where staff like him were expected to stand. His uniform was clean, his posture was still, his face was composed in a way that suggested he'd spent a lifetime swallowing embarrassment before it reached his eyes. Tom stood off to the side, arms folded, expression tight, with the kind of resentment that wore a professional mask. Carol stepped onto the stage without fanfare, no booming introduction, no corporate theatrics, just a woman in a suit, holding a microphone like she was holding a truth the room wasn't going to like. She looked out over them, letting her gaze travel slowly, intentionally, as if she were taking attendance of more than just bodies. Then she spoke. Biogen exists to serve life, not just to sell it. The room quieted, the way it does when people sense a pivot coming, when they realize a leader is about to redraw the boundaries of what's acceptable. Carol continued, Project Lifeline has been at a deadlock. The numbers on a whiteboard were leading us toward a choice that would have protected margins and betrayed our mission. A few executives shifted in their seats. Some faces tightened. The intern from yesterday stared forward, jaw set. Carol didn't flinch. Yesterday, she said, I was reminded that intelligence doesn't wear a single uniform here. A murmur moved through the room, small, restless. Carol lifted her hand slightly, as if calming a room full of weather. She said, I'm announcing 2 changes. First, Project Lifeline will move forward with a pricing strategy that accounts for long-term public value and community access. We will not make a life-saving therapy a luxury product. That statement landed like a stone dropped into still water. Ripples of shock, relief, fear. A few people started to clap, then stopped, unsure if clapping was allowed. Carol waited until the silence returned. Second, she said, we are creating an independent role, Ethics and Community Strategy Advisor, a role that reports directly to me, not to compliance, not to finance, not to marketing. Tom's mouth tightened. He glanced toward the exit, as if he already knew where this was going and hated that he couldn't stop it. Carol's eyes traveled to the back of the room. David, she said. The name felt strange in the auditorium, too human, too specific. Heads turned, searching. People looked over shoulders, scanning faces, trying to locate the person they had trained themselves not to notice. David didn't move at first, not because he didn't hear, but because being called forward in a room like this felt like walking into bright light after years in darkness. Carol waited patient, not rushing him, not using him. David took one step, then another, moving down the aisle as murmurs rose around him like wind. A few people stared openly, confused. Some smiled awkwardly, as if they were trying to rewrite their history with him in real time. When Carol reached the front, she didn't force him into the center like a trophy. She simply stood beside him, equal height, equal presence. She said, This is David. He works in our cleaning department, and he also studies ethics and behavioral economics on his own time. Last night, he left a post-it on a whiteboard that changed the way we saw our decision. A few gasps. The intern's eyes widened, then narrowed, as if offended by the idea that insight could come from below. Carol continued, voice steady. To be clear, David did not erase proprietary information. He did not copy anything. He did not breach our NDA. He did what thoughtful people do when they care about an outcome. He pointed at what was missing. She turned slightly toward David. Biogen will fully fund your education, a doctoral path if you choose it, and starting today, you will serve as our independent advisor on ethics and community value. David's throat moved as he swallowed. His eyes stayed calm, but the calm now had weight behind it, like a dam holding back years of being overlooked. He didn't smile widely, he didn't perform gratitude, he simply nodded once, as if accepting a responsibility rather than a gift. And in that nod, something shifted in the room. Not a fairy tale, a correction. David's first week in the new role didn't feel like a victory lap. It felt like walking through a house that had been yours all along and realizing how many doors were built to stay closed. He still arrived early. Habit didn't vanish just because a title appeared on an email signature. He still knew which hallway lights flickered. He still noticed the way people's eyes slid past him, then doubled back when they recognized his face from the all-hands meeting. Some offered smiles that were too wide, too sudden, like apologies dressed up as friendliness. Others avoided him entirely, as if his existence had become inconvenient proof that their world wasn't as merit-based as they liked to believe. David took it all in without bitterness. He'd spent too long being ignored to be intoxicated by attention. Carol kept her promise. His new schedule included meetings with teams that had never once asked the cleaning department a single question. Compliance, pricing, community partnerships. He listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, it wasn't to shame anyone, it was to widen the lens. He didn't become the hero of Biogen. He became what Biogen had been missing, a conscience that could do math. And for Carol, that mattered more than any headline. The project moved forward, slower than profit maximizers wanted, faster than cynics expected. The pricing model changed. The strategy included access programs that weren't just marketing gloss. The board argued, because boards always argued, but the mission held. David's scholarship paperwork was real, heavy with legal language and clear boundaries. No miracle, no loopholes, just a structured path that respected the system while refusing to be trapped by it. On Friday evening, David stood alone in a quiet office that still didn't feel like his. A suit jacket hung on the back of his chair, new, properly tailored, the kind of clothing that altered how strangers treated you before you even opened your mouth. He put it on slowly and looked at himself in the window's reflection. The suit fit. But he reached into his pocket and pulled out something else. His old Biogen employee badge, scratched, faded at the edges, the photo slightly off-center because no one had cared enough to retake it. He clipped it onto his belt anyway, not as a joke, as a reminder. He didn't want to become the kind of person who forgot the back hallways existed. When he left the building, the city greeted him with the same wet cold it always had. Seattle's sky was low and gray, and the sidewalks shone with leftover rain. David walked without rushing. For once, he wasn't headed to a second shift or calculating whether he could afford groceries and a bus pass in the same week. He found himself drifting, almost unconsciously, toward the transit stop. The same transit stop, the same shelter. The place where the storm had introduced him to Carol before he knew who she was, and before she remembered what it felt like to have nothing in her pockets. He stood under the shelter and listened to the world. Buses groaning as they braked, water rolling off tires, the distant hiss of traffic and rain. A child stood near the edge of the shelter, maybe 10 years old, hood pulled up, arms wrapped around himself, no umbrella, just waiting, trying to look brave. David watched him for a moment, recognizing the posture, not just cold, but practiced patience, the kind kids learn when adults are busy surviving. David reached into his bag and pulled out a new umbrella, sturdy, unbent, the kind that didn't look borrowed from hardship. He stepped closer, careful not to frighten him. The boy glanced up, wary. David opened the umbrella and angled it so it covered both of them. He didn't make a speech. He didn't ask questions that demanded answers. He simply shared shelter. The boy's shoulders eased just slightly. David looked out at the rain and smiled. Not wide, not triumphant, just quietly sure. Because this was the real legacy, not the auditorium applause, not the title, not even the scholarship. The legacy was a choice repeated, to see the person the world forgot to see, to offer what you can without turning it into a performance, to remember that your current position is not your permanent identity, and neither is anyone else's. The bus arrived, headlights cutting through the gray. David didn't rush. He waited with the boy beneath the umbrella, steady as the rain fell, as if he had all the time in the world to be the kind of man he'd always been, even when no one was watching. Every story like this tempts us to believe in a miracle ending, a sudden promotion, a dramatic rescue, a life transformed overnight. But that isn't the real lesson here. David's story reminds us that dignity is not granted by titles, and intelligence does not wait for permission. The most dangerous mistake organizations and people make is assuming that insight only travels downward from power. In truth, Wisdom often lives in the margins, in night shifts, in quiet rooms, in people who listen more than they speak because no one has asked them to speak yet. David didn't change his life by breaking the rules. He changed it by understanding them deeply enough to act with integrity inside their limits. He didn't demand recognition. He left a trace, a small one, just enough to invite someone else to see differently. And Carol's transformation matters as much. Power didn't corrupt her in this story. It humbled her. It reminded her that leadership is not about control, but about attention, about noticing who is missing from the conversation and asking why. The deeper truth is this: most of us have been David at some point, overlooked, reduced to a role, assumed to be less than what we are. And many of us, if we're honest, have also been on the other side, walking past someone without really seeing them. So here's the question this story leaves us with. Who in your life is quietly carrying more wisdom than their job title suggests? When was the last time you chose to listen instead of assume? And have you ever had a moment, small or life-changing, where someone truly saw you when the world didn't? If this story resonates, we'd love to hear yours. Share a moment when you were underestimated or when a single act of attention changed the direction of your life. You can leave it in the comments or send it privately. Your story matters, and it may become the reminder someone else needs. Because sometimes, all it takes to change a system is one person willing to leave a small, honest note behind.